One thing I hear quite often when I tell people I carry a Chiappa Rhino is they say, wow, those guns are so complicated. Have you ever looked under the side plate of one and looked at what's going on in there? It's so much more complicated than a regular revolver. But you know what? That's just not the case. And I've done videos in the past trying to explain that to people, but I don't know if I was too in-depth or if I wasn't in-depth enough, but a lot of people just didn't seem to get it. So tonight I'm going to show you a picture of a Chiappa revolver right next to a picture of the internals of a Smith & Wesson revolver. I think you'll see that for every part in the Chiappa, there's pretty much an analogous part in the Smith & Wesson. There's basically only one real exception to this, and that is where certain elements of the Chiappa revolver had to be broken into two pieces to have an extra pivot point because the hammer is set too low. And we'll go over that when I actually show you. But let's get started here. Let's look at every piece inside the Chiappa and compare it to every piece inside the Smith & Wesson. Now, first off, we'll take a look at the hammers. You can see the hammer in the Smith & Wesson and the hammer in the Chiappa Rhino. Now, a lot of people are surprised that this is the hammer. They think this little part up there at the top is the hammer, but that is not the hammer. We'll talk about that later. This part down here is the hammer. And as you can see, very similar parts. The hammer in the Rhino is really not that different than the hammer on the Smith & Wesson, other than it doesn't have a spur on it and it's in a different place. Now let's take a look at the triggers. Now this is where some people I think get a little confused because it is a little more complicated here. If you look at the trigger on the Smith & Wesson, it looks much larger than the trigger over here on the Chiappa. But that's really not the case. The Chiappa trigger only looks smaller because it's actually been broken into two pieces. It consists of the actual trigger here and this piece that they call an interlock lever. Together, these two pieces make up the trigger, or at least the components that would be on the regular trigger on the Smith & Wesson. And the reason for this, I assume, is because the hammer is set so much lower on the Chiappa. They can't have the same pivot point they would on the regular trigger on the Smith & Wesson, which is up here. On the Chiappa, the trigger itself does have a pivot point up there so that it operates like a normal trigger, but it has a second pivot point down here to allow the interlock lever to pivot lower. Therefore, it can be set lower in relationship to the hammer. And that way it can work just like the hammer does on the other gun. It just has a lower pivot point and has to be broken into two pieces for that purpose. It is still a very simple mechanism. It does not make the gun more complicated. It does not make the gun less reliable. It's super simple, super reliable. And in fact, there are some advantages to this, which you might see later. Now let's look at the rebound slide and the return lever. And you can see those both clearly right here. A little harder to see the return lever because it's kind of behind a couple other pieces, but these two things pretty much perform the same function. They basically provide the power to put the trigger back into place after the gun has been fired. Now they both are spring powered, but they work a little bit differently here. The rebound slide has a little spring inside of it right here that rests against a post, whereas the return lever is actually attached to the mainspring. But they basically do the same thing. Now, I actually like the return lever better and the way it hooks up to the interlink lever, which is one of the reasons I said earlier that I kind of like this design a little better, than I do actually like the rebound slide. I can't tell you how many fingernails I've smashed trying to put one of these rebound slides back in without the proper tools. So these are actually a pain in the butt when you're putting a revolver back together, so I'm not too crazy about them. The Chiappa version is actually easier to work with. Now, one more thing the rebound slide and the return lever do, other than just push the trigger back into position, is they also move the hand back into position. You can see the hand here on the Smith & Wesson, and on the Chiappa, the hand is a little hidden, but trust me, it's right back here behind the hammer, right where I've outlined. On the Chiappa, the hand attaches to the interlink lever, and on the Smith & Wesson, it attaches right straight to the trigger, which is like the same thing because we've already determined that the interlock lever is part of the trigger on the Chiappa, so it's basically the same mechanism. And what the hand does is when you cock the hammer or pull the trigger, it rotates upwards and actually turns the cylinder. And both the rebound slide and the return lever both pull those back into their ready position once the gun has been fired, as well as push the hammers back into their positions. Now, what you might be asking yourself is what prevents the rebound slide and the return lever from springing back into position while the gun is still cocked? And what forces them backwards when you're actually pulling the trigger? Well, the answer to that is the Sears. There's a single action and a double action sear in both guns. In the Smith & Wesson, you can see they're both together right here. And on the Chiappa, you can see one is right here above the trigger and the other one is kind of hidden here behind the hammer. But trust me, both guns have them. I'm not going to go in depth to what Sears really do and how they work. But like I said, trust me, both guns need them. Both guns have them and they work great. So that's basically all you need to know about the Sears. Now, the next part we're going to talk about actually confuses some people when they look into the internals of a Chiappa Rhino, and that is the hammer spring lever. But the hammer spring lever is basically just the stirrup, and you can see both of those things here. As you can see, they both just attach the hammer to the mainspring. The only real difference is that the hammer spring lever is a little bit bigger and it's got a little rounded notch in it there, so that the cocking lever can actually actuate it and cock the hammer. Because you don't actually have a spur on the hammer. This acts as the hammer spur. Imagine on the stirrup over here, if that hammer spur had to apply pressure directly down onto the stirrup to cock the hammer, it'd be the same thing. And we'll talk more about the cocking lever later, but for now, the stirrup and the hammer spring lever are basically the same part. They perform the same mechanical function in both guns, and they work great in both guns. Now, the next part that both guns have that we'll talk about here is the cylinder stop. And this is one place that I think the Chiappa actually has a better designed part than the Smith & Wesson. The Smith & Wesson cylinder stop is ratcheted down when you pull the trigger or cock the hammer, and then a little spring pushes it back up into place once the trigger travels far enough. In the Chiappa, once the cylinder stop goes back into place, there's actually a little stud inside the trigger that mechanically pushes against the back of it, holding it firmly in place. You're not just relying on a spring only, which makes it sturdier. And I like that design better than the one on the Smith & Wesson, but the one on the Smith & Wesson works just fine. So neither one's bad. I just like the Chiappa one better. And the last remaining common part to both guns is the mainspring. And I don't think I need to explain a mainspring to anybody out there that's ever shot a gun, so we'll move on. Now that actually only leaves us with one part in the Chiappa Rhino that the Smith & Wesson doesn't have, and that's the cocking lever. That's the little part right here that kind of looks like a little skinny man with a pot belly wearing a hat. And all that does is take the place of the hammer spur and cock the hammer because the hammer is located inside the gun. And it's just a lever, a simple little metal lever. One of man's simplest and most efficient designs. It's not anything to worry about. And if you look over to Smith & Wesson, it has a part that's very similar in it that the Chiappa doesn't have, and that is the firing pin block. The firing pin block is basically just a little lever that slides up when you cock the hammer so that the hammer can actually make contact with the firing pin. It fills that gap between the hammer and the firing pin. When the hammer is forward, it goes down so that there's a gap between the hammer and the firing pin, and that's so if something hits the back of the hammer, it doesn't activate the firing pin. That's not needed in the Chiappa because the hammer is internal. There's no way to hit it from outside, so that's not a problem. So as you can see, even the cocking lever on the Chiappa Rhino is pretty much a wash. So as you can see, the Chiappa Rhino is not more complicated. It's just a little bit different. And if you ask me, those little differences add up to something great because not only is it firing from the bottom cylinder, which makes it a lower bore axis, they lower the bore axis even more by changing the design of that trigger a little bit because of that lower hammer and shoving the trigger out in front of the mechanism instead of down below the mechanism like it is in a regular revolver. That actually takes that already lowered bore axis and makes the most of it. Which is why the Chiappa Rhino is the best shooting .357 Magnum revolver I've ever held in my hands, which is why I carry one every day. So if you're someone that's been very interested in a Chiappa Rhino, maybe you love the way it looks, maybe you love that whole idea that it fires from the bottom cylinder and therefore just almost eliminates muzzle flip and recoil. If you're one of those people, but you've been afraid to buy one because people tell you, oh, it's so complicated inside, and the more complicated a gun is, the more likely parts will fail. Well, as you can see from the video you just watched, there really isn't that much of a difference between these two guns, so that's really not a valid reason. If anything, I think the Chiappa Rhino is in some ways superior to the old design, especially when you take the lower bore axis into account. So if you're someone that's been interested in one, but you've been scared off by what you hear people say about it, don't be scared off anymore. Go out and try one. And that way you too can decide for yourself if you agree with me about this being probably the best functional carry revolver on the market today. You ain't even my real dad.